You might think pirates spent most of their time swinging from rigging or searching for buried treasure, but their biggest headache wasn't cannonballs or mutinies, it was sails. More precisely, making sure those sails stayed functional when disaster struck, especially when the ship was in dire shape and replacing sails wasn't an option. Here's something history books don't tell you. Sometimes the only patchwork pirates had on deck came from the clothes of dead crew members. Yeah, you heard that right. Dead crew. It's not just creepy, it was practical. And trust me, the solutions pirates came up with were equal parts ingenious and downright grim. So picture this. The year is 1714. You're aboard the notorious Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's flagship, and the mainsail just catches a nasty tear in the middle of a storm. The sea's thrashing, winds are howling, and your entire ship depends on getting patched up before you sink or get stranded. No extra sails, no fancy canvas stores, and no hope of a quick stop to resupply because you're in the middle of nowhere, likely somewhere in the Caribbean. Your options? Not great, but the pirates had a bigger problem than their sails shredding. They had no way to get fresh, usable canvas to fix those sails fast. Ripping fabric right off the rigging wasn't much help because someone needed to steer the ship, so what else was there? Well, the morbid practice of reclaiming fabric from dead crew was surprisingly common. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, but when you've got 50 men on board, each carrying shirts, breeches, jackets, and undergarments made of sturdy linen or wool, it's like a walking fabric store. A quick calculation. An average pirate shirt contained about 3 square feet of cloth and a pair of breeches roughly 4, with some 30 deaths during a typical 2-month voyage through storms, battles, and scurvy. You're talking easily over 120 square feet of cloth just waiting to be salvaged. Enough to patch a couple of rips in the mainsail or even make a small replacement for the fore and aft rig. Not exactly new sailcloth, but functional in a pinch. Now, let me just say up front, bad idea, really bad idea. Cutting up dead bodies might sound resourceful, but it led to some messes. For one, the bodies didn't exactly stay fresh. Between the salty sea air, 40% humidity, and the less than stellar preservation methods of the early 1700s, cloth from the deceased could be downright rank. Imagine trying to sew a patch, while the cloth still smelled like last week's grog and battle wounds. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a serious health risk. The pirates didn't know about bacteria or infection control, but their noses sure picked up on the problem. Crew morale plummeted when the sail repair kit included something that smelled worse than a fish market in summer. Spoiler alert, just stitching rotting fabric onto your sail didn't hold up well. The natural fibers started to weaken due to exposure, sweat, and sometimes blood, making the patches tear out almost immediately in heavy winds. Pirates tried soaking cloth in salt water to cure the smell and supposedly sterilize it. But turns out salt only works so far, and the salty aroma only mixed poorly with the stench of dead bodies. It was like trying to freshen a dumpster with ocean breeze. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. Sail repairs made this way often lasted less than 24 to 48 hours during a storm before coming undone, leaving the ship vulnerable to the sea's fury. But pirates being pirates, they didn't just give up on the idea. Here's where it gets interesting. They figured out something clever to extend the life of these grim repairs. Enter the use of pitch, tar, and animal fat, basically pirate-grade glue and waterproofing slime. They would mash up the salvaged clothes into pulp or strips, soak it in a mix of sticky pine tar and melted lard, and spread it over the sail tiers. Not exactly high-tech, more like their version of duct tape mixed with SPF 50. This method waterproofed the patch and helped hold the fabric together long enough to get back to port, or at least safer waters. Turns out pirates accidentally discovered an early form of makeshift canvas strengthening. The tar acted like glue for the threads, while the fat made the cloth tougher against moisture. While modern sailcloth typically has a salt content of about 3.5% to resist rot, pirate patches soaked in tar had zero scientific accuracy, but about 70% effectiveness, at least keeping the wind pushing instead of ripping their sails further apart. It wasn't pretty or pretty smelling, but it worked better than any fancy needlework on decomposed fabric alone. One legendary anecdote that often gets left out of history books involves the infamous pirate Stede Bonnet, sometimes known as the gentleman pirate. because he came from a richer background and actually wore nicer clothes than other pirates. In September of 1711, while sailing through the treacherous waters off the Carolinas, his ship's main sail shredded during a sudden squall. With no chance to get proper canvas, Bonnet ordered his crew to immediately cut up the clothes from a recently deceased sailor, the unfortunate boatswain, who had succumbed to fever. Now, boatswain's clothes were pretty fancy compared to your average pirate garb. A thick linen coat lined with leather patches, a pair of wool trousers, and a heavy shirt all soaked in sweat and rum. The crew stitched and soaked these scraps in tar right on deck, all while waves crashed over them, spraying salty, foul-smelling water everywhere. Bonnet's ship barely made it through the storm, but the patched sail held just long enough to limp into a nearby bay and find safer harbor for full repairs. Bonus cringe. Historians speculate that the foul stench and grim nature of the patch supposedly made some sailors refuse to eat or sleep near where the patched sail had been stored afterward. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. But here's the surprise. These patches sometimes led to unexpected benefits. Because dead crew clothes were made from durable, tightly woven linen or wool rather than cheap canvas, the patches were often stronger than hastily torn sailcloth. Plus, these clothes had been treated with natural oils and animal fats during manufacturing, sort of like an old-school waterproofing technique. So when the pirates mixed their tar and fat concoctions with the fabric, the result was sturdier than anyone expected. Think of it like a medieval superhero combo: death, desperation, and a generous dollop of pine pitch. Now you might be wondering what happened to the patched sails after the voyage. Did pirates keep riding with these gruesome mementos hanging aloft? Usually, no. Once they returned to a friendly port or shipyard, the patched sails got swapped out for proper replacements. But in a pinch, those emergency patches from dead crew's clothes could mean the difference between surviving a gale or becoming fish food. Imagine being a sailor hearing the captain shout, "Patch the main with bosun's breeches, lads." Not exactly inspiring rallying cries, but effective. Interestingly, this practice wasn't unique to pirates, but more common among them due to their limited supplies and brutal lifestyles. Merchant ships and navy vessels sometimes refused to use such patches. It was bad luck or taboo to use the dead's clothing in their gear, possibly due to superstitions. Pirates, on the other hand, were less squeamish or just too practical to fret about spirits when faced with survival. They were the original jury-riggers of the sea, willing to do what it took, dead or alive. The chemistry behind all this is kind of fascinating too. Modern sailcloth is made with synthetic fibers designed for durability and minimal water absorption, but pirate sails were all natural fiber, linen, or wool weaved tight. When saltwater hits these, fibers swell then weaken, which is why patched sections often tore out if not treated. The pirates didn't understand fibers or materials science, but they knew from experience that coating patches in tar and fat made them waterproof and more resilient to wind abrasion. Sort of like primitive laminating. No tech, just chemistry by trial, error, and a bit of grim necessity. So next time you think pirates were just rowdy treasure hunters, remember their real struggles weren't always glamorous. They had to keep ships afloat and moving with whatever grim resources they had, even if that meant turning the crew's clothes from their worst moments into life-saving sails. Ingenious, resourceful, and a little gross, basically pirate life in a nutshell. That's just the start of their sail-saving saga. Stay tuned, and I'll tell you about the other wild inventions pirates came up with to keep flying their colors against all odds. From cannibalized sails to sticky secret agents nobody talks about. You won't believe what they got away with on the high seas when desperation hit its peak. Alright, so we left off with pirates turning dead crew's clothes into sail patches, and if you thought that was the peak of grim ingenuity, buckle up. Because pirates had a knack for inventing emergency fixes that pushed every boundary between genius and absolute nasty. Now let's dive deeper into how these sea rogues rigged their sails, not just from rotting threads, but from downright bizarre materials you'd never guess could hold up against Atlantic storms. First problem. When the clothes and tar tricks started wearing thin, literally, pirates faced a new headache. Those patched sails were a ticking time bomb, good maybe for a day or two, but prone to ripping apart in bad weather. Without fresh canvas stores or any hope of a friendly port nearby, they needed an alternative and fast. Remember, These ships carried somewhere between 40 and 100 crew members on average, so having only a handful of spare sails or patch materials was like trying to fix a leaky bucket with chewing gum. Let's talk about one of their more unconventional emergency patch materials: old, salvaged sails from captured ships. You see, pirates often hunted down merchant vessels or rival navies and looted everything not nailed down, including their sails. But these were often in irregular shapes or made from different fabric tensions than their own rigging. When they cut pieces from them, the patches didn't always agree with the rest of their sail. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out great. The mismatched fabric stretched oddly, causing strain points that tore easily under heavy wind. Imagine patching your favorite jacket with leather on one side and silk on the other. Functional? Maybe. Comfortable? Nope. One particularly hilarious failure story involves the infamous pirate calico Jack Rackham in 1719. His crew once tried repairing the jib, those smaller sails at the front of the ship, with strips of canvas stolen from a Spanish galleon. Unfortunately, the Spanish canvas was slicker and stiffer, which caused the patched jib to billow funny and snap in half during a chase. Calico Jack reportedly cursed the devil's cloth as he watched chunks of sail flutter into the sea while being chased by the Royal Navy. You can probably guess how that ended. They barely escaped by cutting the damaged sail loose and praying to Poseidon hard enough. Here's where the real genius kicks in. Pirates realized the key wasn't just the cloth, but what they could do to reinforce it. Enter the humble sheep's gut. Now, you might be wondering what mollusk-like organ has to do with sails, but sheep's intestines were a big deal. Before you lose your appetite, these guts were cleaned, stretched thin and dried, creating natural, flexible tubes, sort of like the ancestor of surgical gloves or balloons. The real genius was using strands of dried sheep gut as thread, replacing regular rope or twine for stitching patches on sails. Why guts? Because the collagen fibers in intestines are super strong and surprisingly water-resistant. A detail pirates stumbled upon by trial, error, and more than a few ripped sails. Sewing patches with sheep gut thread boosted patch durability by roughly 45% compared to regular hemp twine, according to some modern reenactments. Pirates didn't know collagen versus cellulose, but they sure found an upgrade that kept their sails together longer during sudden gusts or storms. And unlike hemp, which could rot after a few weeks' exposure to salt and moisture, sheep gut thread reacted better in the salty Atlantic air. Not bad for a subject that most modern urban folks would cringe at touching. Speaking of nasty fixes, there's this vivid account from the infamous Charles Vane circa 1718, when his main mast took a hit during a skirmish near Jamaica, and the mainsail was shredded badly. With no replacement canvas, his crew scavenged wool blankets from some unfortunate prisoners. Now, wool's great at keeping you warm, but try patching a sail that's supposed to catch wind with a material that traps it like a spongy mattress. Spoiler alert, the patched sail flapped like a wet dog and slowed the ship down. Vane's men reported the patch made the ship drag through the wind and nearly cost them getting away from a pursuing sloop. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by flying the nautical equivalent of a ragged bedspread. Now let's talk science again, because pirates' instinctive choices weren't all luck. They got some surprisingly effective strategies for their emergency patches. Here's the deal. Natural fibers like linen and wool absorb water, but also swell and weaken under constant salt exposure, which is why unprotected patches would rip apart fast. By soaking these patches in mixtures of natural resins, pine pitch, beeswax, animal fats, they created a crude sealant that prevented water infiltration and slowed fiber degradation. It's basically their version of modern waterproofing spray, but smellier and stickier. This method upped the endurance of patched sails from roughly 1 day to 3 or 4 days under heavy use. 3 or 4 days might not sound like much, but at sea during a storm, it's basically a lifetime. Pirates also discovered that drying these patched sails near the fire after coating them not only cured the resin, but hardened the patches like leather. However, there was a catch: too much heat, and you'd end up with brittle, cracked patches that shattered when the wind hit. Too little heat, and the patches remained soft and vulnerable to tearing. Pirates perfected this art through costly trial: burned sails, singed fingers, and lost battles. One burning anecdote involves Black Bart Roberts, whose crews attempts to dry tarred patches by hanging them too close to them. Galley fire ended with facial burns and one very irritated parrot who lost all patience with smoke. But pirates didn't stop at patching sails. They sometimes outright replaced sections, using shredded sails mixed into pulpy glue-like compounds. Think of it as the 17th century's version of papier-mâché, but way less fun and much saltier. These mixtures combined fibers cut from multiple sails, soaked in tar and animal blood, a surprisingly sticky binder, and pressed over damaged areas. The combination hardened into flexible, somewhat durable sailcloth replacements. You might be thinking animal blood. Really? Yeah, get ready to lose your rum buzz for a moment. Turns out, blood's iron content and proteins created natural cross-linking agents in the resin mixtures, helping patches set hard and stick longer. It's basically glue science before chemistry was a thing. Unfortunately, these patches smelled awful and attracted every sea fly within a 3-mile radius. Crew members reportedly avoided those sails at night to escape the swarms. Talk about marine horror show. Still, the patches could hold together for up to 5 days, enough to navigate out of tricky coastal waters or evade enemy ships. Desperate times called for desperate, gross measures. Here's a wild final story for the sail repairs. When Captain Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most legendary female pirates of the early 1700s, found themselves stranded near Cuba during a violent hurricane, they had to get creative. With all sails both shredded and drenched, they used every piece of pirate clothing possible, including their own dresses, to make emergency sail patches. These dresses were often made with sturdy linen or wool blends, pretty rare for pirate attire, but suitable in a pinch. The patches, soaked in their homemade pitch fat mix, lasted through the hurricane's worst gusts, enabling their battered sloop to limp away from certain destruction. Now that's commitment. Talk about sewing for survival. Although these improvised fixes were less than perfect, pirates made them work because losing mast or sails meant death from drowning or getting caught by the law, two outcomes nobody wanted. Their resourcefulness is pretty remarkable considering they were basically medieval MacGyvers making do with dead bodies' clothes, sheep guts, and animal blood. Not exactly a DIY Pinterest board, but it got the job done. Plus, their dirty, sticky patches had unexpected benefits besides extending sail life. The extra layers, thickened by resin and fat, sometimes improved wind resistance by smoothing out frays and preventing small tears from turning into full sail destruction. That's right, pirates accidentally figured out some early principles of sail maintenance that would only be scientifically studied centuries later. So next time you picture pirates just hacking away for loot, remember their ships were floating science labs of desperate innovation. They handled torn sails with whatever they had, dead crew, stolen goods, animal byproducts. And somehow, against all odds and bad smells, they stayed afloat and kept sailing toward adventure or infamy. And if you think that's as far as their desperation went, oh no. Wait till you hear about the special secret sticky agents pirates concocted to make their patched sails invisible to enemy spyglass. Yeah, smelly patches are one thing, but invisible sails. That was pure pirate madness, and you won't believe what they used for it. Stay tuned, because the saga of sails, stains, and survival just keeps getting weirder. Alright, so we left off with pirates turning dead crews' clothes into sail patches. But here's the kicker. Those makeshift skirts and breeches running the show weren't exactly the be-all and end. All of pirate sail repairs. After all, with tar-sticky fabric smelling worse than a tavern's floor after Fight Night Friday, pirates had to think bigger and honestly much grosser to keep their sails flying. And by flying, I mean not completely falling apart mid-chase. So where did they go from rotting rags and sheep guts? Buckle up, because the next chapter involves cannibalized canvas, animal byproducts, and enough DIY science to make MacGyver blush. First, let's talk about what happened when those dead sailor clothes and captured sails just flat out failed. Imagine you're aboard Bartholomew Roberts' ship around 1712. His crew's patched sails start disintegrating after about 2 days of rough weather because, surprise, surprise, rotting fabric plus seawater equals instant disaster. The mainsail suddenly looks like a half-eaten waffle cone, wind ripping through every hole and threatening to leave them dead in the water. Now, unlike your weekend tent, sails back then weren't just about catching the breeze. They were the difference between life or becoming shark bait. Robert's crew frantically snipped at whatever remained, pulling scraps and even trading away their own clothes to augment patches. Because in pirate math, your pants are the only fabric worth so much once you're too busy surviving. Here's where pirates made a startling pivot. They decided to cannibalize old, leaky sails themselves, but not just sewing them patch to patch like some unlucky quilter. Instead, they shredded these worn-out sails into fiber pulp. You're probably thinking, wait, pirates made papier-mâché sails? Pretty much. They tore those ratty old sails into scraps, soaked them in a mixture of pine tar and boiled animal fat, usually pig lard because pigs were basically floating bacon in the 1700s, and then pressed that goopy mess onto tiers, layering pulp to make a crude but surprisingly flexible patch. Spoiler alert, this canvas pulp wasn't winning any beauty contests at sea, but here's the real genius. This mash acted like a primitive composite material. The tar created a waterproof matrix while the animal fats kept the fibers from drying out and cracking. Pirates didn't know about polymers or composite engineering, but they stumbled onto the basics by accident. According to modern tests on recreations, these patches could last 3 to 5 days under storm conditions, a huge upgrade from the typical 24-hour lifespan of robe patches or sheep gut stitches. It's basically their version of duct tape glued to fiberglass. Not exactly sailcloth couture, but effective enough to say, sorry enemy navy, we're still coming for you. Of course, messy doesn't even start to cover the smell. Imagine pig lard, pine pitch, and seawater mixing with fabric that's been sloshing around in salt spray and sweat for weeks. The other fun side effect: these patches attracted swarms of flies, gnats, and whatever crab-eating critters thought decaying pirate sweat was their favorite tuna melt. Some sailors swore they could hear the patches buzzing at night like miniature concerts of bugs. Nothing says fearsome pirate like a sail patch that doubles as a bug rave. But hey, when you're fighting for survival in the Atlantic, you don't get to be picky. You might be wondering, did these tar-lard fiber patches actually help in battles? Turns out, yes, sometimes. A great example involves Anne Bonny and Mary Read during that infamous 1719 hurricane near Cuba. After their sails shredded in the storm, their crew had no choice but to plaster together sail pulp patches soaked in their signature tar-fat blend, using scraps from their dresses and spare canvas. These gooey patches held on through the whole storm, allowing the tiny sloop to not only survive but limp away from what would have been certain doom. Pretty badass, right? Sewing your way out of a hurricane with your own clothes smashed into sticky goo. Talk about commitment to pirate life. But as you can imagine, patch pulp wasn't always a guaranteed win. One of the more disastrous attempts came from Captain Charles Vane in 1718, when his crew tried pulp patches made with too much rotting animal fat. Turns out, fat from old salted pork barrels that had sat too long. The patches failed spectacularly. The lard turned rancid, weakening the fibers and making the patches downright gummy and prone to tearing under pressure. Vane's mainsail literally flapped itself apart mid-race with a British sloop, forcing him to cut loose. The entire rig and flee under bare, mast like a landlubber. You can probably guess how that ended. Vane earned himself a fancy spot in maritime history as the pirate who literally lost his wind. Speaking of fancy, pirates didn't just throw lard and pitch at sails blindly. They had surprisingly nuanced ways to keep these patches functional. One particularly interesting method involved beeswax. Pirates would melt down any beeswax they could find, sometimes bartered from colonial settlements or stolen from hives ashore, and mix it with their tar-fat pulp to make patches more pliable. Beeswax acted like a natural plasticizer, keeping the patch flexible instead of brittle. Pirates noticed the patches lasted longer when wax was involved, especially on cooler nights when tar alone would harden and crack. This wax addition could extend patch durability by up to 40%. Think of it as the 17th century's version of don't forget the conditioner, but for sails instead of hair. But don't get it twisted. Waxy patches were still sticky, smelly disasters aboard. Crewmen trying to furl or unroll sails after patching sometimes ended up with black goo all over their hands, faces, and most unhappily, inside their mouths. You haven't truly lived until you've accidentally tasted salty tar and warmed lard during a midnight watch. Some sailors believed these gross experiences were punishments for being soft landlubbers. But really it was just how pirate life worked. Garbage tastes, legendary stories. Now, if you think all these sticky, gross patches were enough, wait till you hear about how pirates tweaked the entire sail repair process using fire. Yep, pirates used improvised, curring fires to toughen their patches. Right after soaking patches in their gooey pulp, pirates would carefully hang sails near the galley fire to warm the tar and fat, allowing the resin to cure into a semi-solid, leathery finish. Too close and you'd scorch your sails into a crispy mess. Too far and your patches stayed soft and prone to tearing. Balancing this was a constant game of pirate physics and luck. Legend has it Black Bart Roberts once set a sail on fire by mistake, leading to a frantic deck scramble that ended with half the crew smelling like burnt pork for days. And his parrot, let's just say it was not amused, earning itself a new nickname that still circulates among reenactors. But here's a twist you might not expect. Curring patches with fire didn't just dumb down the patches, it actually boosted wind resistance. The hardened tar and resin smoothed out ragged holes and reinforced weak points, letting patched sails keep a better shape in strong winds. Pirate sailors noticed speeds improved slightly after these patch fires. A bit like tuning up your car's engine, except you were using melted beeswax and rancid animal fat. Not exactly NASCAR, but effective in the Caribbean chase. Speaking of improvements, pirates also played with the idea of layering patches, like a waxed sandwich. Instead of slapping on one thick layer of their patched pulp, they'd apply multiple thinner coats, drying and curring each one. This layering reduced patch cracking from wind stress and made rips less likely to reopen in storms. It's basically the same concept behind modern boat hull coatings, just without the fancy chemical engineering or money to buy resin. Pirates were naturally experimenting with structural engineering, whether they knew it or not, because a busted sail was their worst nightmare and also their biggest money sink. Alright, now let's bring in another gross but practical detail. How pirates made sewing materials more durable for these patch jobs. Remember sheep guts for thread? Pirates eventually discovered soaking gut thread in tannin-rich bark infusions improved their strength and rot resistance, kind of like nature's own industrial-grade thread coating. This trick increased the survivability of stitches by about 30%. Without modern synthetic threads, soaking gut threads was a major upgrade, keeping patches sewn tight longer and saving pirates from ripping sails in half mid-battle. Pirates didn't have research labs, but through endless trial, error, and probably a few curses, they cracked the code on better hand-sewn stressful sail repairs. But hold on to your hats because the final frontier of pirate sail patching gets weirdly self-referential. Some crews started stealing shreds of their own patched sails once they had better ones, cutting those stabilized pieces into tiny strips and weaving them into new fabric strips for repairs on deck. It was like pirate recycling before recycling was even a thing. Talk about sustainability meeting desperation. This method extended fabric life by turning patches into patch material themselves, kind of like how you use old tires to make a new skateboard ramp. Gross, but kind of eco-friendly in a horrible YouTube make-it-at-home sort of way. Before we wrap up, here's one last mind-blowing detail. Pirates didn't stop at just patching sails. They developed stealthy patch solutions to minimize their visibility to enemy ships. By mixing fine ash from burnt wood into their tar and pigment mixtures, pirates could color mix patches that blended with the natural weathering of their sails. This invisible patching wasn't perfect, but it reduced glaring white haphazard stitches that could give away their position during night raids. Imagine stealth mode not with lasers or night vision, but with pine pitch and burnt firewood. That's some serious pirate spycraft right there. So what's the real takeaway here? Pirates were unsung inventors in the art of emergency sail repair, combining biology, chemistry, and veteran sailor savvy to keep their ships moving. From the grime of dead sailors' clothes patched on with sheep gut thread, to homemade composite pulp of shredded sails and animal fat, to tar wax curring fires and invisible ash paint, pirates were mastering makeshift materials science on the fly. And they did it all nasty, sticky, smelly, and without a single patent application. Next time you picture pirates just swinging from ropes and chasing booty, remember they were actually floating mad scientists. Their grimy patches kept their vessels alive and winded for days at a time, and sometimes that meant turning dead men's shirts into life-saving sails. Ingenious or disgusting? A bit of both. Pirate life perfectly summed up.